Now that we have an understanding of the different paradigms of communication research, we're going to focus in on the sort of territory of what communication theory does. Now, the paradigms themselves really are about all kinds of things regarding research in the social sciences and the humanities writ large. And so these paradigmatic understandings can guide our understanding of theory and method and other sorts of things. But realistically, those could be done across different disciplines. You might find a similar breakdown of objective and interpretive paradigms in things like sociology. So how do we talk about them when it comes to communication? Well, that gets down to how we define the notion of communication as we narrow it toward theory. So in the paradigmatic understanding is those big, giant questions, those meta-theoretical questions about epistemology and ontology. Now, in the 7 traditions of communication as per Griffin, we can start to narrow in on how we actually look at the different units of communication, what is the purpose of theory, and what are they trying to do. So as we do this, we're going to draw from the Griffin text and basically follow the outline that Griffin and his co-authors have outlined for us. And then I'll go through each one of the traditions to quickly make sense of them so you get an idea about what their function is. Well, in the furthest on the objective scale, we have the socio-psychological tradition. Now, theories that come out of this tradition are those that are oftentimes really wedded to the objective paradigm, and they're oftentimes found in the interpersonal and relational communication world. In fact, there's a strong sort of vice grip on objective paradigm studies that come out of interpersonal and relational communication. And this is true in some other instances too. Some discussions of culture are like that. Some discussions of family communication and other moments have a strong reliance on the objective paradigm and the quantification of data. Well, what they're trying to do in this particular paradigm is study interpersonal communication predominantly to seek out those truths of communication. That a lot of the theorists here are trying to find some sort of fundamental truth or law, really, about communication that's a part of the human condition. Oftentimes they're doing that through the research that's conducted on the causal relationships, not casual there, make sure you don't misread that, causal, meaning that if we have factors that are guiding our interactions, such as the example I've used elsewhere, we can look at the factors of eye contact and conversational success, as there is a causal relationship that if I give eye contact in the context of a conversation, that it leads to success. But of course, there's a diminishing return there. But we can look at all kinds of factors that exist in this sort of causal relationship, that one thing causes another, and then something happens, like persuasion happens, or romance happens, or whatever the thing is. The idea here, again, strongly coming out of the objective paradigm, is that communication is guided by fundamental laws or patterns of human behavior. Recall that in the objective paradigm, the world is ordered, it's patterned, and all we have to do is figure out the order of things. In that original discussion, we talked about things like geology. There are only 3 types of rocks out there. You can't find a 4th according to geology. Same thing is true in communication. There are only certain things out there. We just haven't figured out what that law is. We haven't gotten that far yet. Or, like we talked about with Freudian psychology, trying to figure out a universal law of communication, an id, ego, and superego, but in the sense that it's a universal law. Freud believed that he had discovered something, and a lot of people used Freud's work as a springboard to talk about other things, even though a lot of it has been thrown out as well. Well, we move on from the socio-psychological tradition, we can get into the cybernetic tradition, which still has strong roots in the objective paradigm. As we continue on here, we're kind of moving from the objective toward the interpretive, although even that's a little fuzzy. So in the cybernetic tradition, we're looking at systems of information processing. The idea here, just like it sounds in the sort of cybernetic element, is that we are existing in systems, and there's a big machinic understanding of how humans operate. So the idea is that human thinking is like information processing, just like you would have in a machine or a computer. So the human brain is a system, and as a system, it receives inputs and sends out outputs and sorts through those things and through throughput processes and other sorts of things. If you've taken something like small group communication, you probably learned about systems theory as how that's put together. It also sees that as much as the human brain is a system, that relational networks are also systems. And so you have a system that's interacting with another system, and then relational networks get into larger organizational patterns. So there's more systems if you're in a small group or you're in an organization or whatnot. So it basically comes down to humans existing within larger systems or networks, and so systems upon systems upon systems. And that type of theorizing is, again, trying to establish that information processes go through this, and information is processed in particular ways, has feedback and some elements of control. And so the folks that are doing this sort of theorizing, again, position the human sort of world in this systematic nature as systems interacting with other systems. Now, for me, the rhetorical tradition is going to be one of the most important and is very different from the two previous ones. As much as the two previous are strongly wedded in the objective paradigm, and in some cases you can see the objective paradigm surfacing in the rhetorical tradition, one of the things that we're going to look at, and we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, is how rhetoric really spans across the different paradigms, and we'll get there in just a minute. But the rhetorical tradition is really understood as artful public address in the way that it's put together via Griffin here. There's a lot more to that, and we'll talk about that later in the semester. But for now, you can know that the rhetorical tradition is based really out of the humanities. And so it doesn't have that strong social scientific understanding that instead really has its sort of historical roots in ancient Greek culture and elsewhere, and is connected to things like deliberation and democracy and social order and governance. In its really earliest instantiation, people were really focused in on things like persuasion and how we can persuade other people to do things. And so we have folks like Aristotle and Plato that talked at a great length about what persuasion was all about and what rhetoric is all about. And so folks that do this sort of work are theorizing about public advocacy and how we identify with each other. And so the idea is that rhetoric and public speaking, it really is an art. And one of the things that you'll see is we'll talk about that is that we can see the artful creation of these sorts of public addresses through the act of speech making. But that rhetoric has actually been expanded to take into consideration lots of other things. And so it's not just speech anymore. It's now, how we see things through film, television, all kinds of different contexts. And so rhetoric has been expanded. Now, one note is that Griffin really spends much of his time focusing in on ancient rhetoric. And so we can look at Plato and Aristotle here. And if you don't know who is who, on the screen, Plato is on the left and Aristotle is on the right. Plato was Aristotle's teacher, and they have very different conceptions of how rhetoric should operate. And we'll go through some of the history of that when we get to the rhetoric unit of the class. But for now, you can know that the ancient rhetorical discussions, or the discussions about rhetoric rather, were those that were trying to understand a difference between how we engage on a practical day-to-day existence through language, how do we use language artfully, versus perhaps a more philosophical and bigger notion of the fundamental truths of the world. And so Plato and Aristotle kind of went after, they didn't really go after each other per se, but they wrote in very different directions when they're talking about this particular idea. And so we'll come back to rhetoric as we continue. Now, the semiotic tradition is the notion of sharing meaning through signs. And so if there was a science or a study of how signs operate on the smallest of level, this is it. It's the semiotic tradition. And so signs are anything that can stand for something else, and symbols are arbitrary words and nonverbal signs that bear no natural connection with the things they describe. So signs really have a point of primacy when it comes to the semiotic tradition, that everything comes down to signs. And we teach courses in the downtown campus, on the downtown campus, is COM 371, where we spend a lot of time talking about how culture is formed through signs and sign systems. And that's a class that I've taught before, and it can be really interesting. We talk a lot about things like food and how food operates as a sign, and also has a symbolic value. And so we think about all the things that are wrapped up culturally within symbols, and the act of just food consumption, preparation and consumption is quite profound. But the idea here in semiotics is that we're going to study how signs operate and how signs gain meaning, and how the meaning around those sorts of signs is related to a cultural context, but also changes significantly over time. There's all kinds of ways to theorize about that, and you have some folks from back in the day that had some fun with that. This literally translates into, this is not a pipe. And so one of the things that is being played with here is that, in sort of a semiotic game, is that this, if you look at this image, you say, well, that's a pipe. It's like, no, this is not a pipe, because it's an image, it's a sign that represents pipe. And so if we start to see that all language is representative of something else, then we realize that language is sort of this free-flowing game of signs that are interacting with each other. So this isn't actually a pipe, it's a video of me talking to you about an image of a pipe that I stole off the internet. And so there's the sort of semiotic game that we can play. And when we learn that signs and symbols are quite really slippery in the way that they're put together and that meaning changes, we can start to study that. So when we think about how we break down signs and symbols, we can understand that we have a symbol, not really signs and symbols, but symbols as a particular form of signs, that symbols have a relationship to a thought or reference in our minds, but also refer to other types of symbols that are out there. And so this little triangle here is a fun little semiotic and sort of understanding of how signs and symbols operate, especially symbols, and that there's a complicated relationship between not just one symbol and how we make sense of it, but how symbols interact with other symbols. And so one of the things that happens in the semiotic tradition is we start to look at systems of interaction, not on the person level like you have in the cybernetic tradition, but as signs interacting with other signs. And so it gets to a really interesting level where you can understand culture as being formed out of language from this very structured way, which is quite fascinating. Speaking of culture, we're moving on to the sociocultural tradition, which is labeled as the creation and enactment of social reality. Now, this is something we've already talked about a little bit when we get into the discussion of socially constructed realities. The idea here is that language and culture are co-created simultaneously. Now, if you go down to this little thing on the bottom where I have culture, the arrow with communication versus culture and communication with the two arrows, the idea here is that communication isn't just impacted by culture. A lot of folks in the objective tradition, in the socio-psychological tradition, will believe that culture exists as a variable, that if I am of a certain culture, it just changes what I do. And that's that causal relationship. In the socio-cultural tradition, the idea is that culture and communication are affecting each other simultaneously. And so communication is guided by and influenced by culture, but culture is also created, maintained, and challenged through communication. So culture is not some sort of monolithic, static thing, that it's just this thing that affects the way I speak, but instead that the way I speak affects culture as much as the culture that I am affects the way I speak. And so that two-way sort of transactional street there changes the way that we construct our realities. And this is the interpretive camp where we get that notion of socially constructed realities. One theory that comes out of that that's very sort of a famous one is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and by the way, that's not the Worf we're talking about. If there's any Star Trek nerds out there and you're like, what is going on? Then yes, it's actually, that's Sapir, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Worf. And so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that's just a really bad joke. If you didn't catch on to that, it's a really bad joke. But I do it in every class, and I'm not going to stop doing it because, Star Trek, and yeah. Anyway, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is one that talks about how language has a direct impact on our reality. And the examples that they use that are somewhat flawed, but they make the point, is that they studied the Inuit up in the northern part of North America, and studying the Inuit tribes found out that the Inuit had many words for snow. And while they were talking about snow, they would use these lots of different types of words, and that because of that, they would be able to perceive snow in ways that non-Inuit people had a hard time seeing. Now, it turns out that the example, as powerful as it is, was actually false. The Inuit did not have, they theorized something like 60 different words for snow. Well, they didn't have that many words for snow, but the idea there still held up, and they did find in other instances that there were different tribes, because they were studying native peoples in North America, that did have that experience, especially when it came to time. Time was not seen as something as past, present, future, but had a more cyclical understanding. And so the Hopi had a different understanding of time that was more cyclically understood. And the idea is that when you have access to that language and you understand its use, that you actually perceive reality differently. And so that was a part of the theorizing that they're doing. Now, a lot of folks, that by the way, is called linguistic relativity. And so a lot of folks really kind of stepped back from that as soon as they theorized that back about 40 years ago. And they stepped back from that because they thought that that's giving too much power to language. And so it almost thinks that language just predetermines everything around us. And so if I just change my language, that objects and things and people would just disappear. But it really doesn't exist that way. So most of the sociocultural folks are existing in kind of a middle ground, sort of a modified linguistic relativism that does believe that language can shape reality, but maybe isn't so powerful as it makes things appear or disappear. And so the example that we've had in class is the Quidgy-bow, which we talked about in a different presentation. So if you recall, the Quidgy-bow is the chair that I'm still sitting in right now. And so I've changed the language about it and therefore changed the reality about it. That when you, as a COM 207 student, see a chair and think of it as Quidgy-bow, that reality of that object has changed and you might kick it as a consequence. And so I've been using that example for years. And so there might be people all over the place that if you said, hey, look, there's a Quidgy-bow, and then some random person comes up and kicks the chair, then you realize that reality has been changed or shifted. Now, it doesn't change the fact that it's still a chair, but it does change our understanding of what its function might be or what its purpose is and how we think of it. So moving from the sociocultural tradition, we get into the critical tradition. Now, this is where Griffin and I disagree in terms of how we conceptualize critical theory. And so the idea here is that the critical tradition is a part of the overall interpretive camp. But again, a lot of critical folks would think that the interpretivists don't go far enough when it comes to discussions of power. So if you think back to the discussions of paradigms, you'll get a good reminder about all this. And the discussion was that, in that discussion about paradigms, we talked about how critical theory theorizes that there are macro contexts that affect the way that we interact with each other. And that theory in this tradition attempts to uncover and undo those power relationships. And so if we undo them, if we take them apart, then we can change the way that we understand them. Now, language is built by power. And so if language is affected by power, the big example here would be something like gendered language, that we can only perceive the world in particular ways. And the critical scholar is going to go and try to change those. And so the gendered language might be something like in previous generations, because we don't really say this as much anymore, but policeman versus police officer. And so the theory there would say that in previous generations, we didn't have women being in uniform, but that has changed drastically. There are lots of police officers that are women. And so the idea of calling someone a policeman or a police officer instead, a policeman is sort of inaccurate, to say the least. But it also could exclude the idea or the actuality of being a female police officer. So a lot of the folks that are doing this work will point at, like we've talked about before, the media industries that produce culture through capital. And a lot of this will be in that targeted textual analysis to try to unpack those media industries and the messages that they produce. There's also a disbelief or a distrust in science and scientific method, that the scientific method and the objective paradigm that's used is something that doesn't accurately reflect the lived experiences of a lot of folks, and that has a very, not just to say scarred, but problematic history of the use of scientific method. One of the things we learn about if you take methods courses is that there was all kinds of social science that was performed during the Holocaust by Nazi Germany. And so there's a problematic history, to say the least, about some of the methods of science. And so a lot of critical scholars will challenge the ideas of science and challenge the social scientific approaches to say that they have this tarnished history and that we should reject them for it. So if we look at media industries, one of the things that came up, this is pretty old now, but it was an interesting moment, is this image of Beyonce. And so back in the day, she was doing a L'Oreal shoot where she was doing some work and promoting some beauty products, and this was an advertisement that was a consequence of that. Well, she created the advertisement, or she did the photo shoot, and then this is the advertisement that came out. And a lot of folks, critical folks, came out and said that it really looks like they've lightened her skin to make her look, quote unquote, more beautiful. Whereas the real, on the left there, image of Beyonce is one that has in her actual skin color. And so this is the sort of work that critical scholars are going to try to do, is to point at this and say, well, if we associate whiteness or lighter skin color with beauty, that is an inherently racist idea, especially for someone who is already quite beautiful and doesn't need to have her skin lightened. And so this is one of those moments where the critical scholar would step up to challenge this sort of idea and to ask for, basically to boycott the purchasing of the product and to rethink our standards of beauty. And finally, we get to the phenomenological tradition. And the phenomenological tradition is going to be probably the most indebted to the interpretive paradigm as being the furthest that you can get into the interpretive world. The idea here is that we can experience the self and other through dialogue or through our direct interactions with the everyday world. Now, the idea is this: is we have a perception and interpretation of our personal lived experiences, and that if we share those through things like storytelling and direct interaction and dialogue with others, that it helps build an experience of the self and the other at that, again, moment of dialogue. And so a lot of what happens here is that it tries to strip away, to a certain degree, the experiences of communication and of culture and of life away from the signs and symbols, but instead to some sort of direct, tangible experience with the world. Oftentimes this appears at the sort of embodied level, and so we have an affective or embodied perception of the world. Now, if you're asking yourself, affective, I don't know what that means, that might be a new word. Well, affect has to do with a level of perception that isn't quite cognitive. And so if we split the experience of human perception into three levels, which oftentimes is done, we have the affective, the behavioral, and the cognitive. And so the cognitive is the place where feelings and thoughts and reason reside. And so you put all those things in there. And the behavioral is the instinctual and knee-jerk reactions that we have, and behavioral things that we do oftentimes without thinking. And so if you're walking down the street and something falls in front of you, that you move out of the way, and that's your experience of that thing. You didn't really think too hard about doing it, you just behaved in response to it. There's all kinds of other behavioral things as well. Now, the affective is where we have a sort of cursory experience of the world that's tied to things like intuition, and it's almost emotional, but as soon as you tie an emotion to it, it becomes cognitive. And so it's that beneath the surface sort of experience of the world. And one of the best ways to understand it is if you've ever had goosebumps from a song that's really powerful, or a film, or if you've ever walked into a room and while you don't know exactly what it's about, but there's two people in there and you can just tell that they've been fighting. Like, you can't see it necessarily on their faces, but you can somehow feel it in the air. And the phenomenology of that is to say that we have an affective response to that sort of atmosphere. And so affect tells us something. It tells our bodies something and our minds something, but is not something in the level of thought or emotion yet. It's almost a precursor to emotion. And so we experience everything in the world as we go around at all of these levels: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. These things are always working hand in hand. So the phenomenologists want to say, what is our interaction at the lived experience level, and how do we understand that affectively as well as cognitively, and through signs and symbols, but also through an embodied perspective. And so that's oftentimes difficult to talk about, because every time you try to write about the embodied or affective world, then you're putting it into words, which is an experience that really kind of doesn't use words. And so it's a very challenging way to write. But we'll talk about, when we get to relational dialectics, you'll see that we'll talk about the phenomenological tradition a little bit there. So here's the map that Griffin offers, and I'm going to challenge the map and say that we're going to map the territory Hess style, which is a little different. Now, if you look at the map, this is figure 4.1 in the textbook, that Griffin and his co-authors talk about the objective things being on the far left there and the interpretive things being on the far right. And as you move from left to right, you gain a more interpretive approach. Now, the cybernetic and socio-psychological positions there are really strongly rooted in the objective paradigm, so much so that I've added that red line because it's so powerfully understood as being objective, that folks in those territories, really those traditions, rarely step outside of their objective bounds, that they're really trying to establish theory as being, objectively understood through statistics, understood through the quantification of data, and that's how they operate. Versus the other traditions that are all to the right, semiotic and the rest, which are much more strongly aligned in terms of their interpretive elements. So much so that you can actually have lots of conversations between all of these. And so critical scholars will identify with sociocultural folks and phenomenological folks and rhetorical folks, Rhetoric is actually my biggest complaint here, because as a rhetorical scholar, I can tell you that rhetorical scholars pick up from semiotics. They're more recently picking up from phenomenology, and rhetoric scholars are certainly operating at the level of critical. So much so that it's weird to me that Griffin has mapped rhetoric separate from critical, because most rhetorical scholars these days identify as critical rhetorical scholars or critical scholars that study rhetoric or something along those lines. And so the idea that they're separate, especially by the sociocultural tradition, is somewhat odd. And so it's a little reinterpretation of the map that they've offered. So that's it for understanding the sort of mapping the territory, these 7 traditions. As we continue, you'll find that the Griffin text has a discussion of each of the paradigms at the beginning of every chapter. And so if you look to page 131, I just flipped to one randomly, and you'll see the beginning page in chapter 11 for relational dialectics. And relational dialectics comes out of the sociocultural tradition and the phenomenological tradition, and is a highly interpretive theory. And so if you look on that page, you see up in the upper right-hand corner, that there's that brief little thing where it shows the spectrum of objective to interpretive, and it shows the different traditions. This is a nice shortcut for getting to understand how this particular theory is situated in the map that Griffin has offered and on that spectrum of objective to interpretive theories. Again, recognizing that critical somewhat stands aside differently from that. So that's it for mapping the territory. Let me know if you have any questions. There's always room on the discussion board for conversations. And again, just remember that the meta-theoretical discussion about paradigms is a big, huge picture, and now we're starting to narrow down and discuss communication as a particular field and how we can theorize within it.